I'll call the names 2 times. First, I will call Mr. Auchincloss from Massachusetts. Mr. Auchincloss is present. Mr. Benz from Oregon. Mr. Benz is present. Ms. Bice from Oklahoma. Ms. Bice is present. Ms. Bobert from Colorado. Ms. Bobert from Colorado.
Ms. Boger's here.
Ms. Bobert is present. Ms. Bordeaux from Georgia. Ms. Bordeaux from Georgia is present. Mr. Bowman from New York. Mr. Bowman is present. Ms. Bush from Missouri. Ms. Bush is present. Ms. Kamek from Florida.
Yes.
Ms. Kamek is present. Mr. Carl from Alabama. Mr. Carl is present. Mr. Clyde from Georgia. Mr. Clyde is present. Mr. Donalds from Florida.
Yes.
Mr. Donalds is present. Mr. Fallon from Texas. Mr. Fallon is present. Mr. Feenstra from Iowa. Mr. Feenstra is present. Ms.
Sorry, there's a lot of feedback in here.
Ms. Fishbach from Minnesota.
Yes.
Ms. Fishbach is present. Mr. Fitzgerald from Wisconsin.
Yep.
Mr. Fitzgerald is present. Mr. Franklin from Florida.
Yep.
Mr. Franklin is present. Mr. Garbarino from New York. Mr. Garbarino is present. Mr. Jimenez from Florida. Mr. Jimenez is present. Mr. Gonzalez from Texas. Mr. Gonzalez is present. Mr. Good from Virginia.
Yep.
Mr. Good is present. Ms. Green from Georgia. Ms. Green is present. Ms. Harshberger from Tennessee. Ms. Harshberger is present. Ms. Harrell from New Mexico.
Yes.
Ms. Harrell is present. Ms. Hinson from Iowa. Ms. Hinson is present. Mr. Jackson from Texas. Mr. Jackson is present. Ms. Jacobs from California. Sorry, Ms. Jacobs is present. Mr. Jones from New York.
Yep.
Mr. Jones is present. Mr. Kahale. Mr. Kahale is present. Ms. Kim from California. Ms. Kim is present. Mr. LaTurner from Kansas. Mr. LaTurner is present. Ms. Ledger Fernandez from New Mexico. Ms. Ledger Fernandez is present. A representative from the Louisiana 5th District. Is the clerk of the House present?
Yes.
The clerk of the House is present. Ms. Mace from South Carolina.
Yes.
Ms. Mace is present. Ms. Maliotakis from New York. Ms. Maliotakis is present. Mr. Mann from Kansas. Mr. Mann is present. Ms. Manning from North Carolina. Ms. Manning is present. Ms. McLean from Michigan. Ms. McLean is present. Mr. Meyer from Michigan. Mr. Meyer is present. Ms. Miller from Illinois. Ms. Miller is present. Ms. Miller Meeks from Iowa. Ms. Miller Meeks is present. Mr. Moore from Alabama. Mr. Moore is present. Mr. Moore from Utah. Mr. Moore is present. Mr. Mervan from Indiana. Mr. Mervan is present. Mr. Nails from Texas. Mr. Nails is present. Ms. Newman from Illinois. Ms. Newman is present. Mr. Obernolte from California. Mr. Obernolte is present. Mr. Owens from Utah. Mr. Owens is present. Mr. Pfluger from Texas. Mr. Pfluger is present. Mr. Rosendale from Montana. Mr. Rosendale is present. Ms. Ross from North Carolina. Ms. Ross is present. Ms. Salazar from Florida. Ms. Salazar is present. Ms. Sparts from Indiana. Ms. Sparts is present. Ms. Steele from California. Ms. Steele is present. Ms. Strickland from Washington. Ms. Strickland is present. Mr. Torres from New York. Mr. Torres is present. Ms. Van Dyne from Texas.
Yes.
Ms. Van Dyne is present. Ms. Williams from Georgia. Ms. Williams is present. All members are present. We will now load the members' names into the computer, and in one moment we will initiate the random number generator to determine the drawing order. We will now begin the lottery for those members recorded as present. There are 57 members present today. We will initiate the random number generator to determine the lottery drawing order, brought to you by the Fisher-Yates Shuffle algorithm. Please initiate randomization. Randomization has been initiated. The first member to select this morning will be Ms. Harshberger from Tennessee. My Deputy Director, Kirk Nelson, will draw the number out of the box. We'll establish your suite selection order. The first number selected is the number 18. The next member to select will be Mr. Clyde from Georgia. Mr. Clyde selects the number 34. The next member is Mr. Benz from Oregon. Mr. Benz selects the number 48. The next member is Mr. Pfluger from Texas. Mr. Pfluger selects the number 45. The next member is Mr. Nails from Texas. Mr. Nails selects the number 2. The next member is Ms. Salazar from Florida. Ms. Salazar selects the number 55. Next up is Mr. Meyer from Michigan. Mr. Meyer selects lucky 13. Next up is Mr. Carl from Alabama. Mr. Carl selects the number 16. The next member is Ms. Bordeaux from Georgia. Ms. Bordeaux selects the number 42. Next up is Mr. Fitzgerald from Wisconsin. Mr. Fitzgerald selects the number 20. Next up is Ms. Bice from Oklahoma. Ms. Bice selects the number 38. The next member is Mr. Fallon from Texas. Mr. Fallon selects number 47. Next up is Ms. McLean from Michigan. Ms. McLean selects the number 6. Next up is Ms. Kamek from Florida. Ms. Kamek selects the number 39. Next up is Mr. Mervan from Indiana. Selects the number 3. Mervan. Number 3. The next member to select is Mr. Jimenez from Florida. Mr. Jimenez selects the number 24. The next member is Ms. Jacobs from California. Ms. Jacobs selects the number 10. The next member is Ms. Strickland from Washington. Ms. Strickland selects the number 32. Next up is Mr. Obernolte from California. Selects the number 46. Good. Next up is Ms. Mace from South Carolina. Ms. Mace selects lucky number 7. Next up is Mr. Owens from Utah. Mr. Owens selects the number 19. Next up is Mr. Good from Virginia. Mr. Good selects the number 23. Next is Ms. Bush from Missouri. Ms. Bush selects the number 54. Next is Ms. Manning from North Carolina. Ms. Manning selects the number 12. Next member is Mr. Jones from New York. Mr. Jones selects the number 36. Next up is Mr. Auchincloss from Massachusetts. Mr. Auchincloss selects the number 5. The next member is Mr. Moore from Alabama. Mr. Moore selects the number 26. The next member is Mr. Jackson from Texas. Mr. Jackson selects the number 25. The next member is Ms. Maliatakis from New York. Selects the number 17. Next up is Ms. Steele from California. Ms. Steele selects the number 14. The next member is Mr. Bowman from New York. Mr. Bowman selects the number 35. The next member is Ms. Sparts from Indiana. Ms. Sparts selects the number 27. The next member is Ms. Miller Meeks from Iowa. who selects the number 53. Next is Mr. Moore from Utah. Mr. Moore selects the number 51. The next member is Mr. Rosendale from Montana. Selects the number 56. The next member is Miss Bobert from Colorado. Miss Bobert selects the number 11. The next member is Mr. LaTurner from Kansas. Selects the number 57. Next up is Mr. Garbarino from Georgia. Mr. Garbarino selects the number 50. Next is Miss Williams from Georgia. Selects the number 8. Next up is Miss Ross from North Carolina. Miss Ross selects the number 33. The next member is Mr. Feenstra from Iowa. Mr. Feenstra selects the number 4. The next member is Miss Newman from Illinois, who selects the number 9. The next member is Miss Van Dyne from Texas, who selects the number 49. The next member is Mr. Kahale. Mr. Kahale selects the number 30. Next up, Mr. Franklin from Florida. Mr. Franklin selects the number 43. Next member is Mr. Mann from Kansas. Selects the number 41. Next member is Mr. Torres from New York. Selects the number 22. The next member is Mr. Donalds from Florida. Mr. Donalds selects the number 28. The clerk of the House will select for the Louisiana 5th District. The clerk selects the number 29. The next member is Ms. Fishbach from Minnesota. Ms. Fishbach selects 52. Next member is Mr. Gonzalez from Texas, who selects the number 31. The next member is Ms. Hinson from Iowa, who selects the number 44. You okay? Next up is Ms. Harrell from New Mexico. Selects the number 15.
Which one was that again?
Harrell is 15.
Okay, got it, thank you.
The next member is Ms. Kim from California. Ms. Kim selects the lucky number 1. Next up is Ms. Miller from Illinois. Ms. Miller selects the number 40. The next member is Ms. Green from Georgia. Ms. Green selects the number 37. And last to select is Ms. Ledger Fernandez from New Mexico, who selects the number 21. Blackjack. We will now organize the schedule. Members will select in the order starting at 10 a.m. And I encourage you all to call in if you are having issues with your computer to make sure that you don't miss your 10-minute appointment time. Thank you for participating in today's lottery, and we will talk to you soon.